They say some people fade slowly, like embers cooling after a long dead fire. I didn't. I burned out quickly, violently. When I lost my daughter to the fever, my husband to the bottle, and the farm to the drought, it all collapsed in a single season, as if the earth itself had decided I'd had enough reasons to breathe. By the time autumn came, I had stopped talking to anyone. The neighbors eventually stopped calling, the postman stopped delivering, and the land, it just gave up, like I did. The fields turned to dust. The fences sagged like old bones, and the porch became my world. Every morning I sat in the same spot, wrapped in silence, watching the sun rise through the same cracked window, as if hoping it would fail to rise one day and confirm what I already believed: nothing good was left to come. I hadn't seen another soul in months. That morning was no different, at least not at first. The cold bit at my knuckles, and my breath came out in little white clouds. I remember how still. The world was so still. It felt like I was the last one left alive. But then I saw it. Movement. A small figure, barely more than a smudge against the pale horizon, walking down the dirt road that led to nowhere. At first, I thought it was a ghost, or some trick of the light. But ghosts don't stumble like that. They don't limp. They don't carry torn satchels or glance around with the quiet desperation of someone hoping not to be seen. He stopped at my gate and didn't come any closer, just stood there, watching. I almost went inside. Almost. But something about him made my feet move before my brain could protest. I walked out onto the porch and took a better look. He couldn't have been older than 12. His clothes were more patches than fabric. His face was smeared with road dust, and his eyes, God, those eyes, they didn't look 12. They looked older than mine. The kind of eyes that had already buried more than they'd loved. He didn't say a word, didn't raise a hand, didn't beg, just stood there. And that silence said more than anything he could have spoken. I told myself I was only going to give him a piece of bread and a drink of water. Maybe point him toward the next town, if there still was one. But when I opened the gate and he didn't move, I saw the tremble in his hands and how his left leg dragged slightly behind the right. That wasn't just exhaustion, that was pain. Old pain. The kind that's used to being ignored. He followed me to the house without a sound. Inside, everything smelled of dust and memories I tried hard to forget. I gave him what food I could find: a crust of bread, an old jar of preserves, some clean water from the well. He didn't devour it like a starving child. He ate it slowly, respectfully, like he thought someone might take it away. I didn't ask his name. He didn't offer it. That silence between us grew roots. But then I noticed something I hadn't in a long time. I felt watched. Not in a threatening way, but seen. I caught him glancing at me when he thought I wasn't looking, studying the way I moved. The way I avoided certain spots in the kitchen because the floorboards there groaned too loud. The way I flinched every time the wind hit the shutters too hard. After he ate, I expected him to leave. Instead, he looked toward the barn, the one with the roof caved in and weeds growing through the floor like vines reclaiming forgotten ruins. He didn't ask permission, just walked over and started poking around like he was inspecting the bones of a fallen animal. I followed, partly out of curiosity, partly because something had started twisting in my chest and I didn't trust it. He didn't look at the barn like it was ruined. He looked at it like it could still be saved. I wanted to laugh. I wanted to scream. I wanted to shake him and tell him hope was a poison, a trap that tricked you into thinking things might get better. But I didn't. Instead, I stood in silence as he examined rotting beams and rusted hinges. When he spoke for the first time, it was only to mention which parts could be fixed and how. His voice was quiet, calm, like he was talking to himself. I asked him how far he'd walked. He said 2 days. That someone in a dying town said I might need help with the land. I told him I didn't. That this land was past help. That I was past help. But then I noticed his hand gripping the satchel tighter, as if bracing for me to send him away. That's when I realized he hadn't come here just for food. He'd come looking for a place that would let him stay invisible. A place that wouldn't ask questions. I should have sent him off. I should have slammed the door like I did with every other lost soul that came looking for shelter or work or warmth, but I didn't. That night, I let him sleep on the old couch by the fireless hearth. I told myself it was only for one night, that he'd be gone by morning. I was wrong. I thought the hardest part would be letting him stay the night. But the real difficulty came the next morning, when the light crept through the same cracks in the wall I'd ignored for years, and found the boy still there, sleeping on the couch, with his injured leg pulled awkwardly to his chest, like a wounded animal, bracing for another blow. I stood in the kitchen and stared at him for a long while. He didn't look peaceful in his sleep. His brow was furrowed, his hands clenched, but there was something else in his expression. Not fear, not comfort. Something quieter, like relief that he hadn't been sent away yet. I hadn't decided if he'd stay. I told myself that over and over as I boiled water for coffee, gathered the last 2 eggs I'd been saving for a better day, and sliced off the moldy edge of some bread. He hadn't asked for anything, not once. That silence worked its way into me more than any plea could have. By the time he stirred awake, I'd already made breakfast and set it out without a word. He moved slowly, wincing when his leg hit the floor, but he didn't complain, just nodded at the plate and whispered thanks under his breath. So quiet I wasn't sure I heard it at all. We ate like strangers forced into the same space. I chewed too loudly. He barely looked up. The weight of my own silence was heavier than his satchel. After the plates were clean, I went to the porch, thinking he'd take the hint and move on. But instead of packing his things, he started limping around the yard. He stopped by the broken coop, examined the fence, even walked the overgrown path toward the barn. I watched from my chair, arms folded. My instinct was to stop him, to demand where he thought he was going, but something about his gaze as he surveyed the land stopped me. He wasn't judging. He wasn't pitying me. He was calculating. I knew that look. I'd worn it once before everything slipped away. Before I knew it, I was outside too, watching him struggle to pull a fallen rake from beneath a heap of weeds. He didn't ask for help, but I stepped down anyway. Something in my bones moved before my mind could protest. I asked him, without looking directly at him, if he planned on fixing the whole place on his own. He smiled, not a full smile, just a flicker at the corner of his mouth, and said that maybe it just needed someone to believe it was worth fixing. That hit me harder than I expected. So we worked that day. Not efficiently, not quickly, but we worked. I showed him how to rehang a gate without proper hinges. He showed me how to bind a split fence post with the wire from an old chicken run. We said little, but the silence began to change color. Less gray, less heavy. The boy didn't ask for breaks, didn't flinch at dirt or sweat. When his leg gave out mid-afternoon, he sat against a tree and whittled at a piece of broken wood with the blade from his pocket knife. He wasn't idle. He didn't know how to be. That night, I let him sleep inside again. Still just the couch. Still no promises. But I left the door open instead of locking it behind me like I had the past 3 years. The next few days were like that. We moved in quiet rhythm cleaning tools, clearing weeds, repairing what we could with what little we had. The land responded. Like it had just been waiting for someone to notice, it still had something left to give. But as we worked, I noticed things that didn't quite sit right. The boy never mentioned where he was from. He'd flinch when the wind rustled too suddenly through the trees. He always sat with his back to a wall, never with an open window behind him. One night, I caught him watching the road from the porch long after I'd gone inside. His satchel was beside him, clutched tight in his lap like he expected to run. I asked him, not gently, what exactly he was afraid of. He didn't answer, just said that sometimes shadows followed even after you left the fire behind. I didn't know what that meant, but I felt it. In my bones, I knew the kind of shadow that clings. He didn't run, he stayed. And slowly he began to open up, not with words, but with actions. He started feeding the few chickens that wandered back once the coop was cleared. He fixed the loose floorboard on the porch I'd been tripping over for years. He even tried to patch the roof with whatever scraps of tin we could find. His legs still gave him trouble, but he pushed through it. Too hard, sometimes. I found him collapsed behind the barn one evening, pale and gasping. He said it was just the heat, but I saw the swelling. The limp was worse. I made a poultice, like my grandmother used to. He winced as I applied it, but didn't complain. That kind of quiet pain, I'd seen it before, in my husband's face after the accident, in my own reflection for years afterward. Then came the moment that changed everything. We were sorting through the old tack room behind the barn, trying to find anything that wasn't rotted through. Caleb had finally told me his name was digging through a rusted box of nails when he froze. I asked what was wrong. He didn't speak, just held up a small object wrapped in cloth, something he'd buried at the bottom of his satchel. He unfolded it slowly. Inside was a worn photograph, faded, almost colorless. A man, a woman, and a younger version of Caleb standing in front of a wagon. The wagon had a sigil I didn't recognize, but Caleb's expression wasn't on the photo, it was in the way his hand trembled holding it. He said they were gone. Just like that, gone. No accident, no illness, just gone. Left him with someone else. Someone who didn't want him. Someone who gave him away like he was just another piece of junk to trade. He didn't cry when he said it, but I felt the weight of every unshed tear in his voice. I didn't say anything, just put my hand on his shoulder. That was enough. Later that week, strange things began to happen. A rider passed by the property twice in the same day, slow and watchful. Someone left a broken horseshoe near the fancy and old symbol, one I hadn't seen in years, tied to a group that dealt in more than debts. Caleb grew restless. He started sleeping less, watching the horizon more. I confronted him, demanded the truth this time, and he told me, not everything, but enough. His uncle owed money, not to a bank, not to a store, to men who operated in the dark, who took what they wanted when the debt went unpaid. Livestock, tools, people, and Caleby was the payment. They were looking for him, and I realized, in that moment, I wasn't afraid. Not for myself, but for him. Because if they came, they wouldn't just ask politely, they'd take. And I wasn't going to let them. Not again. Not this time. For the first time in years, I felt the old fire stir, the one I buried with my family, the one I thought had died with everything I loved. But it wasn't dead. It had just been waiting for something or someone worth lighting it again. I had lived in that house for over 30 years and never once noticed how vulnerable it truly was. The doors hung crooked on their hinges. The windows were nothing more than old glass sheets in rotting frames. The barn, the coop, the entire damn perimeter was a monument to surrender. I'd built my grief into the walls, packed it into every nail and board like mortar, thinking it would hold off the world. But now the world was coming, and grief wasn't going to stop it. That morning, after Caleb told me the truth about the men, about the debt, about what they wanted, I walked the perimeter of the property with new eyes. Not as a grieving widow, not as a woman waiting to die, but as someone preparing to protect something. Know someone. He hadn't asked me to. He hadn't begged for safety or cried in fear. But he stayed. And I saw it in his eyes, that look of someone who'd long since given up on being saved, but who still carried a flicker of belief that someone, somewhere, might try. I wasn't sure I could live with myself if I let that belief die too. So I started where I could, reinforcing what little still stood, hammering old nails deeper into cracked wood, stacking loose stones into makeshift barricades, dragging what furniture I could to block the lower windows. Caleb worked beside me, not asking questions, not slowing down, even when his leg trembled beneath him. I asked him once if he thought it was worth it. He didn't answer right away, just looked at the crumbling barn and said, "You fix what you can. You fight for what you can't." I nodded like I understood, but the truth was, I didn't know if I had it in me anymore. The next few days passed in a strange rhythm. We worked during the day quietly, methodically, then ate whatever we could scrape together. I taught him how to make traps for small game, how to use every inch of a rusted blade, how to listen to the wind for footsteps that didn't belong. He listened, like his life depended on it, because it probably did. At night, we kept watch in shifts. I took the chair by the window. He took the back door. We never saw anything, but we both felt it, the invisible rope around the house growing tighter. One morning, I found hoof prints in the dirt near the creek. Just one set. No wagon, no livestock, just a rider who'd been watching. Close enough to smell smoke from the chimney. Far enough not to be seen. I didn't tell Caleb right away. I didn't want him to know how close the storm had come. Instead, I rode into town for the first time in months. I kept my head down, hat low, and walked like I had business no one should question. I visited the general store, pretending to shop, and listened for rumors, but the whispers were too faint. People weren't talking about us yet. Then I saw something that turned my stomach to ice. A man, leaning against the edge of the feed store, tall, lean, with a jagged scar that ran from his ear to the corner of his mouth. He was watching the road out of town, not moving, not blinking, just waiting. He didn't see me. I made sure of it. But I saw him, and I knew. Vance. I hadn't heard his name in years, but I'd heard stories. He worked for someone worse. A man who didn't care about land or livestock. He wanted leverage, control, fear. And Caleb. Caleb was a message. A reminder to others not to run. I left town without buying anything. Rode hard back to the farm, dust in my throat and fire in my chest. When I got home, I didn't say a word, just started digging through the back shed. Caleb followed, confused at first, until he saw what I was after. My husband's rifle. I hadn't touched it in years, hadn't even looked at it since the night he died, wrapped in a soaked blanket on our porch, lungs full of storm water and regret. But the metal still gleamed. The weight was still familiar. I cleaned it slowly, methodically, while Caleb sat nearby, silent. He didn't ask if I could use it, didn't ask if I'd be willing to. He just watched. That night, we lit no fire, ate in silence, slept lightly. The air felt heavier. Even the wind moved differently, like it knew what was coming. Sometime around midnight, I heard it. A creak on the porch. I held my breath and reached for the rifle. My fingers shook not from fear, but from memory. I edged toward the front window and peeked through the curtain. A figure stood by the fence, not moving, not speaking, just watching. Then it turned and disappeared into the trees. I didn't sleep again that night. The next day, I made a decision. I sat Caleb down on the porch and told him plainly, if he wanted to run, now was the time. I'd give him food, water, enough coin to make it through the next county. He looked at me like I'd slapped him. No, he said. Just that. You don't understand what's coming, I whispered. I do, he replied. That's why I'm staying. I didn't argue. I didn't have the strength. We spent the day fortifying the barn, hammered planks across the weakest walls, cleared the rafters, dug a shallow pit inside the floor where we could hide if needed. When night came again, we didn't speak, just sat by the door, backs against the wood, listening. And then it happened. A distant sound, hoofbeats. Slow, deliberate. One rider at first, then two, then more. Coming closer, I reached for the rifle, chambered around, and felt something cold settle into my bones. This wasn't going to end with words. And for the first time in years, I was ready. The wind had a strange kind of stillness that night, the kind that presses against your chest like a warning before the first crack of lightning splits the sky. I remember sitting on that porch, my back straight, rifle across my lap, and thinking for the first time in years that I didn't feel old anymore. I felt dangerous. We'd done all we could that day. Reinforced the doors, covered the lower windows, spread broken glass along the paths leading to the house. It wasn't much, but it was enough to make a statement. We weren't going quietly. The sun had set early, disappearing behind bruised clouds that looked swollen with a storm that wouldn't come. That kind of dark sits thick in your lungs, makes the world feel smaller, tighter, like something's about to burst. Caleb had taken the attic. The rifle I'd taught him to handle nestled close, though I knew he wouldn't fire unless he had no other choice. The boy still carried too much hope for that. But I didn't. Not anymore. I kept my post by the front window, eyes fixed on the horizon, waiting for the inevitable. I didn't have to wait long. Around midnight, the sound arrived, hooves crunching gravel, slow and deliberate, as if each step was chosen for effect. Not a full gallop, not yet. Just the kind of trot that says we're not in a hurry because we already own what we came for. Then the torches appeared. 6 of them, moving in a staggered line across the open field that led to my house. The firelight made them look taller, crueler, their shadows stretching across my land like claws. At the front of the pack was the scar-faced one Vance. I knew it was him even before the torchlight hit that jagged line splitting his face in two. He didn't dismount when he reached the gate, just stared up at the house, shoulders relaxed, like he was about to start a conversation instead of a siege. The others fanned out slowly, one toward the barn, another toward the side of the house. A few stayed near the road, watching for signs of movement, trained, efficient, not hired guns. This wasn't their first extraction. They expected fear, panic, a door swinging open, a boy tossed to the ground, a widow begging for mercy. That was their rhythm. But I wasn't going to give them rhythm. I was going to give them silence. I didn't move from my chair. I didn't call out. I just let the seconds stretch, let them wonder how much I already knew, how prepared I might be. Because sometimes not reacting is the loudest scream you can offer a predator. Then came the first move. One of them stepped off his horse and approached the house. He wasn't reckless, but he wasn't careful either. That told me everything. He wasn't expecting resistance. Just wanted to get close enough to bang on the door or maybe peek through a window. He got 4 steps past the porch gate before I fired. The bullet landed in the dirt 2 feet in front of him on purpose. The crack of the shot tore through the silence like a scream, and every man on that road froze. Horses reared, torches wavered, and for a long breath, the only sound was the echo bouncing off the trees. I chambered the next round with a calmness that surprised even me. The man who'd been walking backed up slow, both hands visible, but Vance just chuckled, the sound cruel and low. Then he dismounted. He walked to the gate with that same lazy confidence. I watched his hands, no weapon drawn, but his eyes, they didn't blink, didn't wander, just locked onto mine through the broken glass of the window, like he could already taste the victory. He stopped at the gate, still didn't speak, just tipped his chin, like he was waiting for me to crack. He didn't. That stare lasted maybe 15 seconds, maybe more. Time gets weird when you're standing on the edge of something irreversible. Then he turned to the men and motioned them forward. And just like that, the siege began. 2 flanked the house. 1 tried the barn. Another circled wide to cut off any escape through the backwoods. They were methodical, working angles, testing weaknesses, no shouting, no gunfire. Just the quiet precision of people who'd done this 100 times before. But they weren't prepared for how well I knew that land. I moved through the house with the rifle grip tight, listening to every board creak, every gust of wind push against the siding. I'd lived in that house long enough to know what wasn't natural. And I felt it before I heard it, the shift in the air near the side window. I crept to the edge of the hallway and waited. Boots on the porch. A slow turn of the knob. Then a push. He didn't expect resistance. So when the door didn't give, he pushed harder. That's when I fired again through the door this time. The blast sent him sprawling backward, shouting to the others. I heard the scramble of feet, the curse of surprise. And for a moment, just a moment, I think they realized this wasn't going to be a simple job. But they didn't leave. No, that's not the kind of men they were. They regrouped. I saw them from the attic window when I climbed up to check on Caleb. He was pressed low, watching them, hands steady. I nodded to him. He nodded back. Then I spotted it. Another rider further back, watching from the ridge, not joining in, just observing. I recognized him too late. The judge. He'd come to make it official, to sign away a child like he was nothing more than livestock. And beside him was a man I hadn't seen in person, only heard described. Thin, nervous. Too young to look that tired. Caleb's uncle, the coward, had brought the law with him to seal the deal. I felt something cold and sharp twist inside me. Not fear, not even anger, just a bitter kind of clarity. They weren't just trying to take the boy, they were trying to erase him, make his existence nothing more than a debt payment. A cautionary tale, a name on a ledger, and I wasn't going to let that happen. Not while I had blood in my veins. I used to think fear was a thing that screamed at you, a loud, panicked voice that tore through your chest and left you breathless. But real fear, the kind that comes for you when you're already hollowed out, that fear is quiet. It waits. It settles into your bones and makes itself at home, whispering that maybe this time you won't survive it. That night, with Vance's men spread across my land and Caleb's uncle lurking near the ridge like some ghost from a story that never ended well, fear wasn't screaming. It was listening. After the second shot I fired through the door, there'd been no return fire. No yelling. Just that awful silence again, like the world was holding its breath. I knew they were repositioning. I'd seen enough cowardice dressed as strategy in my life to recognize it. They wanted to rattle me, wear me down, make me fire first, fire early, and run out of ammo before the real confrontation started. But I wasn't new to waiting. Grief had taught me how to outlast storms far colder than this. Inside the house, everything had a pulse. The walls creaked with tension. The lantern flames shivered. The floor beneath my boots felt like it might split if I took one wrong step. Caleb had moved to the stairs, his shadow long and still against the wall. He didn't ask questions. He just waited just like me. I didn't speak to him. Didn't need to. We had become something wordless by now. A bond forged not in joy, but in shared ruin. I slipped through the hallway and lifted the corner of the curtain just enough to see them. Vance's men hadn't retreated. No surprise there. They were setting up positions, using the tree line and collapsed parts of the barn as cover. A few were still mounted, circling wide. They were hunting. But I was too old and too angry to be prey. The judge hadn't moved from his perch. Neither had Caleb's uncle. They weren't part of the siege, just the witness and the traitor, both waiting for the story to end in the way they'd arranged. Clean, quiet, legal. I hated them more for their stillness than I did for their cruelty. At least Vance bared his teeth. They just smiled with their paperwork and signatures, thinking words on parchment were stronger than a woman who'd already buried everything she loved. They didn't know the kind of war a broken heart could wage. Time blurred. I don't know how long we waited. 10 minutes. An hour. More. Long enough for the nerves to wear down into something sharper. I checked my rifle. 8 rounds left. Not enough. Never enough. Then, movement. A flicker near the west side. A figure creeping low toward the porch, too careful, too precise. I raised my rifle and waited. Breath shallow, hands steady. But he didn't shoot. Because this one, he was different. Smaller, slower. Not one of Vance's hired ghosts. It was a child. At least, it looked like one. But when he stepped closer to the lantern light that hung beside the barn ruins, I saw the truth. Thin frame, ragged clothes, barefoot. Decoy. A trick. They'd found some desperate kid and promised him coin or food to walk up to the house, to draw my fire, waste a bullet, reveal my position. I wanted to scream. Not from anger, but because this was what monsters did. They didn't always use violence. Sometimes they used need. They turned hunger into bait and innocence into shields. I lowered my rifle. The boy crept closer, his steps hesitant, head low. I saw Vance behind him now, crouched in the shadows, waiting for the moment I'd aim again when he'd rush forward and make his move. I stood slowly and walked away from the window. Let them stare at the empty room. Let them wonder what I was planning. I found Caleb near the back entrance. He'd seen it too. The child. The setup. His jaw was clenched tight, his hands curled into fists at his sides. I could see what it did to him to watch someone else be used the way he almost had been. He wanted to run out there and stop it. And maybe I would have too, if I didn't know better. But some things can't be undone with courage alone. The moment you open that door, you've made a choice. So I grabbed Caleb by the shoulder and pulled him close. His heartbeat was like a hammer in his chest, loud and furious. But he didn't resist. Sometimes restraint is the only weapon you have left. Minutes passed. The child lingered, unsure. Then Vance hissed something from the shadows. I didn't hear the words, but the message was clear. Go further, or don't come back. The child took 3 more steps. And that's when the dogs arrived. I'd forgotten about them, truth be told. Half-wild strays that wandered the edge of my property for years. Too smart to be tamed. Too mean to be chased off. I used to feed them scraps during winter, and they returned the favor by scaring off raccoons and coyotes. But I hadn't seen them in weeks. Not until now. 2 of them burst from the tree line with the kind of growls that shake your ribs. The child screamed not from pain, just from terror and ran. Vance cursed loud enough for the whole field to hear. The decoy fled back into the dark, the dogs on his heels but not biting, just herding, warning. It was the first sign all night that not every living thing on that land had forgotten how to fight. Vance barked new orders. His men repositioned again. And now they were less careful, more angry than calculating. The siege was losing shape. That gave me something rare. Leverage. I moved through the house like a ghost, checking windows, angles, blind spots. I marked where they were, counted movements, predicted lines of fire. My husband used to say I was better at hunting than he was. I'd laughed at the time. Now I understood he hadn't been joking. I knew this house better than any fortress. I'd built it to keep things in. But tonight, it would keep monsters out. Then the knock came. Not a bang, not a shout. A knock. Slow, rhythmic. 3 soft raps on the front door. Mockery. I didn't answer. He knocked again. Then I heard his voice low, smooth, practiced. Vance. He said my name. How he knew it, I didn't want to ask. He told me I was making a mistake. That the boy wasn't worth the trouble. That men like him never stayed loyal. That I'd fight for him, bleed for him, and he'd leave me the moment it suited him. He said all of it with the kind of poison that only comes from truth half remembered. But I'd heard it all before. When my husband died, the neighbors said I should sell the land. When my children got sick, they said I should pray harder. When I shut the door on the world, they said I deserved it. But none of them stayed. Only ghosts and silence did. And now Caleb. And I would not bury another child just to keep the peace. I moved back to the front window, rifle ready, and whispered to the dark, "If you want him, come and try." Vance didn't respond, but he didn't retreat either, which meant the worst was still coming. And we were running out of night. I didn't sleep that night, not even for a minute. The kind of sleep that used to come after a hard day's labor on the farm, that honest, aching sleep that felt like a reward had long abandoned me. What I had now was something colder, sharper. I wasn't tired. I was taut, like a drawn bowstring, waiting for the release. The dogs had gone quiet after their burst of fury. They vanished back into the woods, their growls still echoing faintly in my ears like a warning. Vance had stopped talking through the door, and that made it worse. When men like him got quiet, it meant they were planning something, and I knew what kind of something. Around midnight, I told Caleb to go upstairs. I didn't ask, I told. He didn't argue. He just looked at me like he knew it might be the last time he saw me alive. There wasn't a word exchanged. We'd gone beyond language at that point. Grief, fear, trust, they had their own ways of speaking. I gave him the pistol. My husband's second gun, the one with the cracked handle. Caleb didn't want to take it at first, but I made him. I told him to stay behind the dresser, keep the window open, and shoot only if they tried to come for me. Not before. Not unless. And then I waited. The front room had always been where I sat to drink coffee in the early hours of the day back when the sunrise still meant something. Now I crouched low behind the old stove, rifle balanced across my knees, watching the moonlight stretch across the floor like it was dragging a noose with it. I heard them before I saw them. Footsteps. Low, deliberate. trying too hard to be silent. Someone was near the side porch, another near the back window. I couldn't see them, but I could feel them, like the house itself had become nervous, creaking beneath their weight. Then, the first shot? It didn't come from me. A window shattered in the back room. Not glass, just old wood and dust blown open by the butt of a rifle or maybe someone's boot. I didn't move, didn't twitch. I knew that's what they wanted. Panic. Noise. Reaction. But they didn't know me. I let them come in. A second crash closer this time. Someone had forced the door near the kitchen. 2, maybe 3 boots stomping in. Heavy, confident. They thought this would be easy. 1 old woman, 1 scared boy. A house barely standing. They thought wrong. The moment I heard the first voice deep, gravelly laughing, I raised the rifle and fired through the hallway. I didn't wait to see if it hit. I didn't need to. The silence that followed was loud enough to know I'd struck something. Maybe not flesh, but fear. And fear spreads fast. Another voice shouted something. I couldn't hear the words, just the panic in them. Good. I moved low through the front room and circled toward the back. The smoke from my shot hung in the air like a spirit that refused to leave. I could smell the burn of old gunpowder, sharp and metallic. My hands didn't shake. I thought they would, but they didn't. Because for the first time in years, I wanted to survive. A shadow moved past the kitchen window. I raised my rifle again, steady, and waited. The man ducked. He knew I was watching now. He cursed, loud and sloppy. Another shot rang out, this one not minioned, hit somewhere near the pantry wall. The house shuddered. I heard wood splinter. And then I heard Caleb. He screamed. Not in pain. In warning. Behind you. That was all. I turned, just in time to see a figure barreling through the hallway, tall, fast, wild-eyed. He must have come through the cellar hatch. My mistake. I'd forgotten the latch could still be pulled from the outside. But he didn't freeze. I brought the butt of my rifle up hard, slamming it into his chest before he could raise his weapon. He fell, coughing, reaching for something on his belt. I didn't wait. I drove the stock into his face-once. Twice, until he stopped moving. I could feel my heart trying to escape my chest. Not from fear. From rage. From survival. I was done losing. Another shot shattered a window upstairs. Then I heard Caleb's gun. 1 sharp report, then a scream. I ran. He was crouched low, blood running down his arm, but alive. One of Vance's men was sprawled in the hallway near the top stair, moaning, clutching his leg. Caleb had hit him clean through the thigh. I grabbed the pistol from his hand, shoved him back behind the dresser, and told him to stay. This time, I didn't ask. He nodded, and I descended the stairs like a woman possessed. The house had become a battlefield. My battlefield. Every floorboard, every nail, every drafty window, I knew them. I used them. By dawn, 2 of Vance's men had fled. 1 was still bleeding on my porch. Another had locked himself in the barn, praying for daylight or reinforcements. And Vance? He hadn't shown himself. Not yet. He was waiting. Always the coward, king-letting others bleed first. The judge had vanished, along with Caleb's uncle. I assumed they didn't want gunpowder on their hands when the law came around. If it ever did. I dragged the wounded man off my porch and left him in the dirt. I didn't speak to him, didn't ask his name. He was one of them. That was enough. The sun rose slow and gray, crawling over the hills like it was ashamed to see what had happened. I stood in the doorway of my house, my body bruised and battered, but standing, still breathing, still holding a rifle that had fired its last shot. Caleb joined me minutes later. He didn't say anything. He just looked at the wreckage or broken windows, blood on the floor, the smoking wood around the kitchen, and nodded once. I asked if he was okay. He nodded again. Then we both turned our eyes to the horizon, because we knew it wasn't over. This was just the first wave. Vance would come back. He always did. And next time, he'd bring more than desperation and hired guns. Had bring var. and we would be ready. The sun had barely risen when the first whispers started drifting through the town like smoke carried on a restless wind. People talk, especially when they hear about a widow standing against men like Vance and his hired guns. The kind of talk that spreads fast and pulls at the fabric of small towns until everything unravels. I heard their voices from my porch, muffled but impossible to ignore. They called me the Mad Widow, the woman who'd lost her mind, the troublemaker. None of that mattered anymore. What mattered was that the silence I had wrapped myself in for so long was gone. The world had found me again, whether I wanted it or not. Caleb sat beside me, still nursing his arm but growing stronger each day. His spirit hadn't broken, neither had mine. We were both survivors, carved out of pain and hardened by loss. I saw in him a flicker I hadn't felt in years, a flicker of hope and fight. He was my anchor now, and I was his. The first challenge came sooner than I expected. Word spread about the skirmish on my farm, and within hours, strangers began to show up, men in suits, faces unfamiliar but eyes sharp and calculating. They weren't lawmen, though they carried themselves like they were. They said they were here on behalf of the county, interested in settling disputes and restoring order. But their words rang hollow. They were Vance's men dressed in different clothes, shadows disguised as daylight. I refused to let them step foot on my property. I told them the land was private, the house was mine, and any attempts to intimidate or harass me would be met with the same force as before. They laughed, and that was their mistake. One of them, a thin man with cold eyes, pulled out a piece of paper stamped with the county seal. It was a legal order, claiming Vance's authority over the land and ordering me to surrender Caleb and vacate the property within 24 hours. They said the judge had signed it the night before, without a public hearing, without my knowledge. The paper burned in my hands. It was more than a legal document. It was a weapon, forged to strip me of the last thing I held dear. But I wasn't going to fold. I looked each of them in the eyes and told them I would not leave. Caleb was under my protection. The farm was my home. If they wanted to take him, they would have to go through me first. That night, the county courthouse was a different kind of battlefield. Inside the dimly lit chambers, the judge sat behind his bench, his face pale and drawn. The man who once swore to uphold justice now twisted it to serve greed and fear. He spoke softly with Vance's men, plotting their next move. They were untouchablers, so they thought, but they hadn't counted on the people. The next morning, the church bell rang, louder and more insistent than I'd heard in years. It called the town together, summoned by whispers and rumors. Caleb and I watched from the porch as familiar faces emerged, neighbors, farmers, shopkeepers, people who had once looked away, who had buried their own fears beneath silence. Now they came carrying tools, pitchforks, even old rifles, ready to stand with the Mad Widow against the tyranny creeping into their lives. It was a fragile alliance, born from desperation and shared suffering. The same debts, the same broken promises, the same looming threats haunted them all. Vance's grip wasn't just on me, it was on the entire county. Days passed in a tense standoff. We fortified the farm, repaired the fences, and prepared for whatever was coming. Caleb and I worked side by side, hands blistered but spirits unbroken. I taught him how to load the rifles properly, how to listen for the faintest sound in the night, how to read the signs of danger before it arrived. At night, we shared stories not with words, but with glances and shared silence. Our pasts intertwined in a tapestry of loss and hope. We were two broken souls forging a new family in the shadows of a crumbling world. Then came the night they struck again. Under a new moon, the quiet was shattered by the roar of engines. Vance had brought reinforcements, mercenaries hired from outside, men with no ties, no mercy. They came fast and hard, crashing through fences and tearing up fields. The county's peace was gone, replaced by chaos and fire. We fought like desperate animals. Every shot fired a scream against the darkness closing in. Caleb was wounded again, this time in the side, but he didn't falter. I covered him, dragging him to safety while returning fire. Our neighbors fought too, their courage surprising even themselves. The barn caught fire. Flames licked the sky like hungry ghosts, swallowing years of hard work and memories. I stood in the smoke, rifle raised, refusing to back down. The night echoed with the sounds of battle, the crack of gunfire, the shouts of men, the cries of the wounded. But amidst the chaos, something changed. The people who had once turned their backs on me now stood shoulder to shoulder, fighting for a future they thought lost. The county was waking up, shaking off the chains of fear and silence. When dawn broke, the mercenaries had retreated, leaving behind a trail of destruction but no victory. Vance's name was cursed in every home, his power broken but not destroyed. Caleb and I surveyed the ruins, exhausted but alive. The fight was far from over, but for the first time I felt something knee hope that we could win, that this broken land could heal. And as the sun rose over the battered fields, I knew one thing for sure: we were no longer alone. The morning after the battle, the farm was unrecognizable. Smoke still curled lazily from the charred remains of the barn. The fields were torn up by tires and boots, and the fence that once marked my land's boundary now lay in broken splinters, scattered like forgotten promises. Yet amidst the ruin, something unshakable stirred within me, a determination that no amount of destruction could snuff out. Caleb was sitting on the porch steps, his face pale but eyes burning with a fierce light. He wasn't just a boy anymore, he was a survivor, and I could feel the weight of that realization settle on my chest like a stone. The fight we'd waged had been more than a struggle for land. It was a battle for dignity, for the right to live without fear. But victory had a price, and the cost was just beginning to reveal itself. The county's whispers had grown louder, and not all of them were in our favor. Vance's men weren't just defeated, they were humiliated. And humiliation breeds vengeance. In the days that followed, the courthouse became a hub of shadowy dealings. The judge, that pitiful excuse for a man who once wielded the law like a shield, now looked more like a desperate man clinging to the last strands of power. Rumors spread that he was trying to find a legal way to evict us without igniting another firestorm. But every attempt felt like a game played with loaded dice. The law was no longer a refuge. It was a weapon pointed at our throats. One evening, a letter arrived, its edges rough and hastily torn. The handwriting was unfamiliar, jagged like a claw. It contained a thinly veiled threat, a promise that if we did not surrender Caleb and abandon the farm by the next full moon, our lives would be forfeit. The words were cold and precise, a reminder that mercy had no place in this fight. I held that letter in my hands for a long time, feeling its weight. It was a summons to war, a challenge that I couldn't ignore. Caleb came to me quietly that night, his voice steady despite the turmoil swirling inside him. He said he was ready to fight, that he wouldn't run anymore. For the first time, I saw no trace of fear in his eyes, only resolve. But the truth was, I was terrified. Not for myself, but for him. This boy who had lost so much already. The boy who had walked 2 days to find hope at my doorstep. And now, that hope was a target painted on his back. I spent restless nights pacing the rooms of the house, running my fingers over the dusty furniture, trying to remember a time before loss became a constant companion. The farm was more than land. It was a testament to a life once lived, a life that had slipped through my fingers like water. But I refused to let it end like that. I called upon every favor I had left in this county, friends who still believed in justice, the neighbors who had come to our defense, even the loners who lived on the outskirts. One by one, they answered, bringing supplies, offering shelter, sharing stories of their own battles against the darkness creeping into our lives. Together, we began to rebuild not just fences and barns, but a community strengthened by shared pain and common purpose. Yet, the real battle was not fought with rifles and torches. It was fought in the shadows of our minds, in the moments when doubt whispered that we were too broken, too few, too weak to stand against the tide. But every time I looked at Caleb, that doubt faltered. His presence was a beacon, a reminder that even in the deepest darkness, a single light could cut through. One afternoon, as the sun cast long shadows over the fields, a figure appeared on the ridge overlooking the farm. At first, I thought it was one of Vance's men, scouting, planning their next strike. But as he approached, I recognized the worn hat and hesitant gait. It was Eli, an old friend who had disappeared years ago, swallowed by debts and despair. Eli's return was unexpected, but it brought with it a glimmer of hope. He carried news from the neighboring townsouthers who were resisting, fighting back against the same forces that threatened us. They were organizing, quietly but determinedly, forming a network that could not be easily broken. That night, around a fire fueled by dry wood and stubborn hope, Eli shared stories of resistance and rebellion, of people who refused to be pawns in the game of debts and power, who risked everything to reclaim their lives. His words ignited a fire in us all, rekindling a spirit that had been dimmed but never extinguished. But with hope came new dangers. The judge's men grew bolder, their tactics more ruthless. Sabotage became common tools disappearing, crops vandalized, livestock stolen. The farm was a battlefield not only for our lives, but for the very soul of the county. One evening, as I tended to the wounded Caleb, the wind carried a faint, sinister laughter from the darkened woods. It was a chilling reminder that the fight was far from over, and that the shadows we faced were darker and deeper than I had feared. Yet, in that moment of fear and uncertainty, I realized something vital. We were no longer just victims of circumstance. We were fighters, survivors, a family forged in the crucible of loss and resilience. The farm was more than land. It was our home, our sanctuary, our last stand, and we would fight to the very end. The nights grew colder, and so did the threats. The county felt like a pressure cooker about to explode. Every shadow held a secret. Every rustling leaf whispered a warning. The scars on my farm were a map of the battles fought. But the war was no longer just against men wielding guns. It was against a creeping fear that threatened to choke the life out of everything I held dear. Caleb and I moved through the wreckage of what was left of our lives like ghosts, never fully present, always alert, always waiting for the next strike. His limp had worsened, the old injury refusing to heal properly, but the boy's spirit burned brighter than ever. He spent hours studying the land, mapping defenses, and learning how to wield the pistol he now carried with quiet confidence. I could see the weight of responsibility settling on his young shoulders, but he never complained. Instead, he pushed harder because surrender was not an option. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon and painted the sky in fiery hues, we gathered with a small group of neighbors who had pledged their support. They came quietly, like shadows themselves, wary of prying eyes and ears. Among them were old farmers, a retired sheriff, and a handful of young men and women tired of living in fear. Their faces were etched with exhaustion but also fierce determination. We sat in the dilapidated barn, the walls scarred but standing, and made plans. The idea was simple but dangerous. If we could strike at the heart of the debt collection ring, disrupt their supply lines, and expose the judge's corruption, we could weaken their grip on the county. But it meant stepping into the shadows ourselves, risking everything to fight back. As the night deepened, I looked around at the faces illuminated by flickering lantern light and realized we were no longer alone. We were a movementa fragile, desperate family bound by loss, but driven by hope. But the darkness wasn't idle. Word spread fast. The judge's men responded swiftly, their brutality escalating. Our crops were torched, fences torn down, and one of the neighbors found his barn set ablaze in the dead of night. Fear was their weapon, but it only steeled our resolve. Caleb and I spent long nights reinforcing the farm's defenses, digging trenches, setting traps. The boy had become my equal in this feat, a partner, a son, a beacon of everything I was fighting for. There were moments when exhaustion threatened to swallow me whole, but then I would catch his steady gaze, and I would find the strength to keep going. One morning, as the first frost glazed the fields, a rider arrived on I hadn't expected. It was Sheriff Reynolds, a man of few words but undeniable honor. He'd been watching from the sidelines, waiting for the right moment to step in. His arrival was a turning point. He came with evidence documents proving the judge's involvement in illegal land seizures, threats, and corruption. The sheriff's presence gave us hope, But it also made the stakes clear. The corrupt powers would not relinquish control without a fight, and that fight would be merciless. Over the next weeks, the farm became a fortress and a beacon. People came and went under cover of darkness, sharing news, supplies, and plans. Caleb trained with the sheriff's deputies, learning how to read danger before it arrived. I found myself dreaming again not of the past, but of a future where fear no longer ruled our lives. Yet, the shadows lengthened. One night, a trap was sprung. Vance's men, enraged and desperate, attacked under the cover of a moonless sky. The battle was fierce, and brutal gunfire shattered the silence. Screams pierced the night, and the earth was torn asunder by chaos. We fought with everything we had, fueled by a fury born of years of pain and loss. In the heat of the fight, Caleb was struck down, a bullet grazing his leg and sending him crashing to the ground. My heart seized as I crawled to his side, dragging him behind the shattered remains of the old barn. Blood soaked into the frozen dirt, but his eyes met mine with a fierce refusal to give up. The firefight lasted until dawn, and when the last of the attackers fled into the mist, we counted our losses and our blessings. Caleb's wound was serious but not fatal, and the sheriff promised justice. But I knew this was far from over. As the sun rose, casting a pale light over the battered farm, I stood beside Caleb and felt the weight of what we had endured and what was yet to come. We were scarred but unbroken, a family forged in fire, ready to face whatever storms the future held. Because sometimes survival isn't enough. Sometimes you have to fight to reclaim your life. And we were ready. The night after the attack lingered in my mind like a restless ghost, refusing to let me rest. Caleb's injury was healing, but the pain in his eyes was deeper than any bullet wound. The farm was quiet now, but that silence was the calm before the storm. The fight had stirred something old and dangerous. The truth was no longer hidden, and the powers that be were closing in. Sheriff Reynolds had been relentless, digging through paperwork, chasing leads, exposing the rotten core of the county's corruption. The judge, Vance, and their cohorts were no longer shadows. They were exposed criminals scrambling to save their skins. But criminals who feel cornered are the most dangerous kind. I had spent 3 years drowning in grief, convinced that fighting was pointless, that I was too broken to make a difference. But Caleb changed everything. His courage wasn't just in facing his own demons, but in making me face mine. The boy's hope became a spark that ignited a fire inside me, a fire I hadn't felt since before the darkness swallowed my family. That fire pushed me to stand up to the judge, to the corrupted officials, and to the men who thought they owned this land. We gathered evidence, testimonies from the frightened, the beaten, the silenced, the people who had lost everything but their will to survive. We became their voice. But justice is never a swift tide. It is a slow and grinding storm. The courtroom battles were fierce. The judge wielded his power like a weapon, twisting laws and buying loyalties. Vance sneered from the sidelines, his threats like venom dripping from his lips. But Caleb and I stood firm, our bond a shield against the darkness. Every hearing was a battle. The sheriff's deputies kept us safe. But the real fight was in the hearts of the people to believe that change was possible, that one broken widow and one scarred boy could take on a corrupt system and win. It was a fight against despair itself. The turning point came on a cold morning when an unexpected ally stepped forward. One of Vance's own men, tired of the lies and bloodshed, brought forth damning evidence. Ledgers, secret payments, orders signed in the judge's own hand. The courtroom fell silent as the truth spilled out, raw and undeniable. Vance's empire crumbled piece by piece. The judge was forced to resign, his name dragged through the mud. The debts were declared null and void, their illegal hold over the county broken. For the first time in years, the people could breathe without looking over their shoulders. But victory came at a cost. The scars of the battle ran deep. Caleb's leg would never be the same, and I carried the weight of years of loss and fight etched into my bones. Yet, there was something new, a fragile hope, a promise that we had reclaimed not just the farm, but our lives. We rebuilt together, not just the land, but ourselves. Neighbors returned, laughter found its way back into the house, and the fields bloomed once more. Caleb and I became more than just survivors. We became a family forged in fire and healed by hope. The past would always be a shadow, but it no longer ruled us. We had found a new dawn, one earned by courage and love. And as I looked out over the rising sun casting golden light across the fields, I knew this was only the beginning. Because sometimes, the darkest nights birth the brightest mornings, and ours was finally here. The dawn that day felt different. It wasn't just the sun rising over the horizon, spilling golden light on the fields. It was the rising of something new in both Caleb and me. For the first time in years, the heaviness in my chest felt lighter, as if the land itself was breathing alongside us, healing. The battle we fought was not just against men with guns or corrupt officials. It was against the very weight of loss, fear, and despair that had settled deep inside us. I had thought I was finished, a broken widow with no purpose but to wait for death. Caleb, with his scarred leg and quieter strength, had proven me wrong. Together, we were more than survivors. We were warriors of hope. Months passed, and the farm came alive again. Every patch of earth turned, every seed planted was a testament to our refusal to surrender. Caleb, despite his injury, worked harder than anyone I'd ever known. He never complained about the pain, nor about the shadows that sometimes darkened his eyes when memories from the past slipped through. I could see the burden he carried, and sometimes it mirrored my own. But the most beautiful thing was how we found family in each other, not by blood, but by choice. We rebuilt not only the fences and the barn, but the fragile trust and hope that had been shattered long ago. Neighbors came back, cautious but curious, and slowly, kindness replaced suspicion. The nights were still the hardest. Sometimes I'd wake to the silence of the house and feel the ghosts of my past creeping back. But then Caleb would be there, sitting quietly, reminding me we were not alone anymore. His presence was a balm to my soul, and mine to his. The county was changing too. Sheriff Reynolds and the new officials worked hard to clean up the mess left by greed and corruption. It was slow, imperfect, but steady progress, proof that even the darkest systems could be cracked by courage and truth. One afternoon, as the sun dipped low and painted the sky in shades of pink and orange, Caleb and I stood together on the porch. He looked out over the fields, a smile breaking through the tiredness in his eyes. "We made it, didn't we?" he said, his voice soft but filled with a certainty that surprised me. I nodded, feeling a lump rise in my throat. "Yes, we did. Against all odds." He turned to me, eyes shining with a fierce hope. "Thank you for not giving up on me." "No," I said firmly. "Thank you for reminding me what's worth fighting for." The farm, once a symbol of decay and loss, was now a beacon of resilience. Our story was no longer one of surrender, but of rising, of finding light in the darkest places, of choosing hope when despair seemed easier. If this story has touched your heart, if you believe in the power of hope and the strength of the human spirit to overcome even the deepest wounds, then stay with us. Subscribe now and join a community where stories like ours remind us all that no matter how dark the night, a new dawn is always possible. Because sometimes, all it takes is one step, one act of courage, one hand reaching out in hope to change everything. Here ends the journey of Martha and Caleb. Their fight was not just for land or justice, but for the right to hope, to live, and to belong. Thank you for sharing this story with me. If you want more powerful stories that inspire and move you, click the next video on your screen. And don't forget to subscribe and hit the bell. Your support means the world, and together, we'll explore more tales that remind us why we keep fighting.